This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The first thing Delia felt was the cold. Not the cold of a room, but the cold of a body that had forgotten how to hold heat. A hollow, foreign cold that started somewhere behind her sternum and radiated outward until her fingertips ached with it. She opened her eyes to a ceiling she didn't recognize, high and coffered, ribbed with dark wood beams that caught the grey light, bleeding through a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere, far below, the muffled hum of a city moved like a tide she could not see. She tried to sit up, and pain exploded behind her eyes, white and total, and a sound left her throat that didn't feel like her own voice. Don't. The word cut through the room like a blade unsheathed. You'll tear the stitches. A man rose from a chair near the window. He had been sitting so still, so utterly without sound, that she hadn't registered another living person in the room until he moved. And even then he moved like something poured, rather than something walking. All liquid economy, no wasted motion. He was tall, dressed in black from throat to shoe despite the hour, his jaw dark with 2 days of stubble, his eyes a shade of grey, so pale they looked silver in the window light. Handsome in the way a blade is handsome, beautiful and made for cutting. Who? Her voice cracked. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Where am I? Something moved behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. He crossed the room in 4 strides and stopped at the edge of the bed, close enough that she could smell him. Cedar, gunmetal, and something darker beneath, like smoke that had settled into a coat and never quite left. He did not touch her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided he will not lose twice. You don't remember, he said. It wasn't a question. Remember what? Remember, who are you? The silence that followed was long enough that she heard her own heartbeat in her ears, fast and frightened. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped, gone quiet in a way that was somehow more dangerous than if he'd shouted. I'm your husband. Delia laughed. It came out, broken, disbelieving, edged with the particular hysteria of a person who has just been told something so absurd it must be a joke, and then watched the joke fail to land. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply watched her laughter die in her throat as she understood, with the terrible clarity of the truly lost, that he meant it. That's not... I don't... She pressed her palms against her eyes, and pain screamed up from her temple where gauze was taped along her hairline. Fragments assaulted her, headlights, wet asphalt, the scream of tires, glass raining like something biblical. A woman's voice, her own, shouting a name into the dark. And then nothing. A door closing on a room with no windows. There was an accident, the man said, 3 weeks ago. Your car went off the coastal road outside Positano. You hit your head. The doctors say the memory loss could be temporary, days, weeks, longer. They don't know. He said this the way a man reports troop losses, flat, controlled, a fact to be managed rather than mourned. And yet his hand, when it finally moved, betrayed him. It hovered an inch above hers on the blanket, trembling almost imperceptibly, before he drew it back and clenched it at his side, as if he'd caught himself reaching for something he had no right to. "What's your name?" she whispered. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Alessandro. Alessandro Ferrara. And I'm Delia Ferrara. He said her married name like a vow renewed, like a claim staked freshly into ground he intended to defend. My wife. She looked down at her own hand and found, for the first time, the ring, heavy, ancient-looking, a black diamond flanked by two smaller white stones set in dark gold, worn smooth at the band, as though it had been on her finger a long time, or as though someone had rubbed their thumb over it in worry, over and over, waiting for her to wake. "I don't remember marrying you," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "I don't remember you." "I know." Something raw moved through his expression, there and gone like lightning behind storm clouds. Grief, maybe, or something crueler, something that looked almost like guilt. "But you will. I'll make sure of it." There was a promise in that sentence that should have comforted her. Instead, lying in a bed she didn't recognize, in a room too grand for anyone but royalty or criminals, staring into eyes the colour of a blade drawn in moonlight, Delia felt something colder than confusion settle into her chest. She felt afraid. Not of the accident, not of the gaps in her memory, black and yawning like a mouth that had swallowed weeks of her life whole. She felt afraid of him, of the way he looked at her, like a man standing guard over something he had already buried once and refused to bury again. Of the certainty in his voice when there should have been none. Of the fact that when she searched his face for something familiar, for the smallest flicker of recognition that might anchor her to this life he claimed was hers, she found only a stranger. A beautiful, dangerous stranger, watching her the way a wolf watches a door it has already decided cannot be opened from the outside. "Where's the nearest hospital?" she asked. "I want a second opinion. I want—" "You're not going anywhere." He said it gently. That was the worst part, how gently he said it, how the words were wrapped in a softness that didn't disguise the iron beneath them at all, only made it more unmistakable. "You're safe here. That's all that matters right now." Safe from what? His silence answered louder than words could have. Outside the windows, far below, the city of Rome glittered like scattered coin, indifferent to the woman waking inside a fortress of glass and stone, with no memory of the life she was told belonged to her, and no way yet to know how much of what she'd just been told was true, and how much was the first careful thread in a lie built to keep her exactly where he wanted her. She would spend weeks unravelling it. She had no idea yet how much unravelling it would take to reach the truth, or that the truth, when it finally came, would be so much worse than anything her missing memories could have hidden. For now, she only knew this. The man who called himself her husband had not once in the entire conversation told her that he loved her. He had only told her that she was his. The penthouse, she learned over the following days, occupied the top 3 floors of a converted palazzo on the edge of Rome's most exclusive district. A building so old its foundation stones had been laid before America existed, and so thoroughly modernized inside that it felt like stepping from the 17th century into an architect's fever dream. Travertine floors, polished to mirror shine, walls the colour of aged parchment, art that Delia suspected, with a lurch in her stomach, was not reproduction. A woman named Marta brought her meals on a silver tray and refused to meet her eyes for longer than a few seconds at a time. A man named Cesare stood outside her door at all hours, a gun holstered visibly beneath his jacket, and inclined his head to her with the stiff formality of a soldier saluting a superior officer's wife. Not with warmth, but with something that looked disconcertingly like fear. Everyone in this house was afraid of something. Delia was beginning to suspect it was the man who called himself her husband. "You're staring," Alessandro said on the fourth morning, not looking up from the papers spread across the breakfast table, a sprawl of documents in Italian she couldn't pass from this distance, stamped with seals she didn't recognize. "I'm trying to remember you," she said honestly. "It's not working." He set down his pen. In the daylight, without the shadows of that first night, she could study him properly for the first time. The sharp architecture of his face, cheekbones cut like something chiselled rather than born, a small white scar bisecting one dark eyebrow, and those eyes, pale as winter, that never seemed to blink as often as they should. He wore a white shirt, open at the collar, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and she found herself noticing, with an unwelcome little jolt low in her stomach, the corded strength in his wrists, the way his hands looked like they knew how to be gentle and violent in equal measure, and had simply chosen, for now, gentleness. "What do you remember?" he asked. "Anything?" "Pieces. Colours. A kitchen that isn't this one. Yellow walls, I think. A dog, maybe. A woman's laugh that isn't mine." She rubbed her temple, where the ache still lived, dull and constant. "Nothing about you. Nothing about this." She gestured at the room, the wealth of it, the danger she could feel humming under the marble like a live wire. "Your mother," he said quietly. "The kitchen. She died when you were 19. You don't have a dog, you're allergic. The laugh might be your sister's. Rosa." "I have a sister." Something shifted behind his eyes, careful, calculating, the flicker of a man deciding in real time how much truth a lie could survive. "You did. She passed 2 years ago, before we married." Delia sat back, breath punched from her lungs. Grief for a woman she couldn't remember arrived anyway, sudden and disorienting. Grief with no shape, no face, only the raw fact of loss dropped into her chest like a stone into still water. "How do I not remember any of this?" "The doctors call it psychogenic amnesia with organic overlay," he said, the clinical phrase sitting strangely in his mouth, too rehearsed. "Trauma. Sometimes the mind protects itself by closing doors it isn't ready to open." "Protects itself from what?" He looked at her for a long moment, and in that look she saw, or thought she saw, something that might have been pity, might have been calculation, might have been the particular tenderness of a man who has decided a woman is safer not knowing certain things. "From losing me," he said finally. "The crash. You thought I was in the car." "Were you?" "No." A muscle in his jaw. "I wasn't." He didn't elaborate, and something in the set of his shoulders told her not to push. She had learned already, in 4 short days, that Alessandro Ferrara answered exactly as many questions as he wished to answer, and not one syllable more, and that when a subject closed in his face, it closed like a vault door, total, silent, unbreachable. Tell me what you do, she said instead, changing tactics. For work. Imports, shipping, real estate. A pause, deliberate, testing. Some things you're better off not asking about in detail. That's not an answer. No, he agreed, and something almost like admiration crossed his face. It isn't. She looked past him, out the window, at the men she'd noticed stationed at the gates below, at the black cars idling in the courtyard, with drivers who never seemed to leave their posts, at the discreet cameras mounted at every corner of the property, like the eyes of some watchful god. Alessandro, are we in danger? He rose from the table then, came around to her side, and crouched beside her chair so their eyes were level. An intimacy she wasn't prepared for, close enough that she could see the faint grey ring around the silver of his irises, close enough to smell cedar and coffee, and beneath it that dark, unnamed thing that seemed to live in his skin permanently. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something low and private, meant only for her. You will never be in danger, he said, not while I'm breathing. Whatever else you don't remember, remember this. I would burn this city to ash before I let anything touch you. Do you understand me? It should have terrified her. Later she would wonder why it hadn't, why instead her pulse had leapt traitorously, why some reckless, memory-hollowed part of her had leaned infinitesimally toward him instead of away. That's a very intense thing to say to someone who doesn't remember you, she managed. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something colder and more honest than a smile, a baring of teeth that belonged more to a predator confirming its territory than a man comforting his wife. I've always been intense about you, Delia. Amnesia hasn't changed that. Nothing changes that. He stood, and the moment broke, and he was already crossing to the door, already retreating into whatever fortress he kept behind that composed face. But she sat there long after he'd gone, turning his words over like stones, and thinking that a man who loved his wife should not sound, when he spoke of loving her, quite so much like a man issuing a threat to anyone who might try to take her away. She didn't yet understand that the threat wasn't rhetorical. She would. The house had a wing she wasn't permitted to enter. Delia discovered this on the 7th day, wandering the corridors in the restless, aimless way of a woman still learning the shape of a life she'd been told was hers, when she found a door at the end of the east hallway locked, and beyond it, through the crack beneath, the ghost glow of a single lamp left burning in an empty room. That's Signor Ferrara's private study, Marta said quickly, appearing as if summoned, her rosary beads clicking nervously between her fingers. He asks that no one goes in, yes, I gathered. Delia studied the older woman's face, the way her eyes kept darting to the door and away, the way her hands wouldn't be still. Marta, how long have you worked for the family? 15 years, Signora. Then you knew me? Before? Delia stepped closer, lowered her voice. What was I like? What was our marriage like? Marta's face did something complicated, grief and fear and something that looked almost like pity, braided together into an expression she visibly fought to smooth away. You were happy, Signora, she said, too quickly, too smoothly, the way people say things they have rehearsed. Very happy. You're a terrible liar, Delia said, not unkindly. Marta's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of something raw and frightened in her eyes, before she gathered herself and retreated down the corridor with a murmured excuse about dinner preparations, leaving Delia alone with a locked door and the growing, itching certainty that everyone in this house was performing a version of the truth curated specifically for her. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay beside Alessandro. They shared a bed, though he kept, she'd noticed, a scrupulous and almost pointed distance on his side, as though touching her were a privilege he'd revoked from himself, and listened to his breathing even out into the slow rhythm of sleep, and then, carefully, silently, she rose. The study door, she discovered, wasn't locked after all, only closed. Someone, Marta probably in her haste, had left it that way by accident, and Delia, heart hammering, slipped inside. It was a beautiful room, dark wood and leather, a wall of books, a desk bare except for a single framed photograph turned face down. She crossed to it with the guilty stealth of a thief and turned it over. A wedding photograph. Herself, younger somehow, or perhaps only lighter, laughing at something outside the frame, radiant in white silk, on the steps of a church she didn't recognize. And beside her, she frowned. The man in the photograph was Alessandro. It had to be Alessandro, the same dark hair, the same cut traw, dressed in the same exacting black. And yet something about him snagged at her, some details she couldn't name, a wrongness too subtle to articulate, like a word on the tip of her tongue. His smile in the photograph was different, wider, looser. There was a warmth in the curve of it that she had not once, not in 7 days, seen cross the face of the man sleeping in the bed down the hall. She set the photograph down, unsettled, and turned to the desk drawer, locked, and then to the bookshelf, where a slim leather ledger sat wedged between 2 larger volumes, its spine unmarked. She pulled it free. Names. Columns of them, dates beside them, sums of money that made her stomach turn. 6 figures, 7. Some crossed through in red ink, others circled, and on the final page, a single name written by itself, underlined 3 times. Volkov. Beneath it, in smaller, more hurried script, the debt is not forgiven, it is only delayed. He will come for what is owed, and he will not care whose name is on the door when he does. Footsteps in the corridor. Delia shoved the ledger back into place with shaking hands, killed the lamp, and had barely made it behind the door when it opened, and Alessandro's silhouette filled the frame, backlit by hall light, utterly still. Delia. I couldn't sleep, she said, and her voice, thank God, came out steady. I was looking for a book. He didn't move for a long moment. In the darkness, she couldn't read his expression, only the tension coiled through his frame, a stillness that felt like the half-second before violence. Then he crossed the room, took her wrist, not roughly, but with a grip that brooked no argument, and drew her out into the corridor, pulling the study door shut behind them with a soft, final click. This room isn't for you, he said, low. Why not? It's your study. I'm your wife. Because there are things in there that would frighten you, he said, and I would rather you be happy than frightened, even if it means keeping secrets, even if you hate me for it later. His thumb moved absently over the pulse point of her wrist, and she felt her own heartbeat betray her, fast and traitorous, beneath his touch. Please, Delia, trust me on this. Just this. Trust is difficult, she said, when I don't remember earning any reason to give it. Something flickered across his face. Pain, unguarded and real, gone almost before she registered it. I know, he said quietly. I'm trying to earn it back, every day. Give me time. He walked her back to their room in silence, and she lay awake long after his breathing slowed again, staring at the ceiling, turning over the name written in that ledger like a stone in her palm. Volkov. A debt not forgiven, only delayed. She didn't know, yet, what that debt had to do with her. She would learn, eventually, that it had to do with everything. 2 weeks after she woke, Alessandro told her they were going out. A benefit, he said, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror, while she stood behind him, in a gown Marta had laid out without explanation. Deep emerald silk, backless, cut in a way that made Delia feel like a stranger in her own body. For the children's hospital, we attend every year. People will expect to see you. People who knew the old me, Delia said. The me with memories. People who love you, he corrected, turning, and something in his gaze as it travelled over her, slow, unhurried, unapologetically possessive, made her skin heat despite herself. You look extraordinary. Marta chose the dress. I chose the colour. He stepped closer, and his hand found the small of her bare back, warm and certain, guiding her toward the door, with a touch that felt less like affection and more like a brand being pressed into skin. Mine, it seemed to say, without a single word spoken. Emerald was always yours. It matched your eyes. I couldn't let her choose anything else. The benefit was held in a ballroom that made the penthouse look modest. Chandeliers the size of small cars, a string quartet, women in gowns that cost more than Delia suspected most people's homes, men who greeted Alessandro with a deference so absolute it bordered on fear. She watched the room bend around him wherever he walked, conversations dying and restarting in his wake, and understood, with a cold clarity that settled into her bones, that whatever imports and shipping meant, it did not explain the way grown men flinched when he extended his hand for a shake. Delia, my God, it's really you. A woman intercepted her near the bar, dark-haired, striking, dressed in blood red, regarding Delia with an expression so nakedly assessing that it took a moment to place it as anything other than hostility. I heard about the accident. I'm so relieved you're, well. Her eyes flicked just once toward Alessandro across the room, and something private and complicated passed over her face before she smoothed it away. I'm Bianca Conti. We were close once. Before. I'm sorry, Delia said. I don't remember. Before what? Before you married him. Bianca's smile didn't reach her eyes. You used to tell me everything, Delia, every secret. It's strange, isn't it? Talking to someone who used to know all your secrets and having none of them anymore. She said it lightly, but there was an edge underneath, sharp as a blade wrapped in silk. How are you finding married life? To him, I mean. Confusing, Delia admitted. Everyone's very careful around me, like I'm made of glass. You're not glass, sweetheart. Bianca leaned in, her voice dropping. You're the one thing in this world that man has ever wanted more than power. Careful is the least of what you should expect from a house like his. She straightened as Alessandro appeared at Delia's elbow, his arm sliding around her waist with a fluid, territorial ease that made Bianca's smile go brittle. "Alessandro, you're looking well. Marriage agrees with you." "Bianca." His voice had gone cool, formal, a door closing. "Enjoy the evening." It was unmistakably a dismissal. Bianca held his gaze a beat too long, something unspoken passing between them, history Delia couldn't read, but could feel, thick and charged, before she inclined her head and melted back into the crowd. "Who was that, really?" Delia asked when they were alone at the edge of the dance floor. "No one important." His jaw was tight. "She said we were close before I married you." "Bianca says a lot of things." He drew her onto the dance floor before she could press further, one hand settling at her waist, the other closing around hers, and despite everything, the tension, the unanswered questions multiplying by the day, Delia found herself moving with him as though her body remembered a rhythm her mind had lost, as though some muscle memory of this, of him, of the particular way he held her, like something precious and dangerous both, had survived the crash when nothing else had. "You dance like you've done this 1,000 times," he murmured against her temple. "Maybe I have. With you. Maybe." His hand tightened fractionally at her waist. "I hope you remember someday. Not for my sake, for yours. I think you'd like the woman you used to be. I think you'd understand her better than I ever managed to." There was something in the way he said it, a strange, sorrowful distance, as though he were speaking of a woman he'd failed rather than one he'd loved, that snagged at her, small and sharp as a splinter she couldn't yet locate. But then the music shifted, and his hand slid lower on her back, and the warmth of him, the low murmur of his voice near her ear, the sheer, overwhelming physical fact of him crowded out the thought before she could examine it. Across the room she caught Bianca watching them, her expression unreadable, and beyond her, near the doors, a man she didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, pale-eyed, watching Alessandro with an intensity that had nothing to do with admiration. "Who's that man by the door?" she asked. Alessandro's whole body went still. By the time he'd turned to look, the man was gone. "No one," he said, but his hand had found the small of her back again, harder this time, and his eyes swept the room with the swift, practiced efficiency of a soldier counting exits. "Delia, I want to leave." "We just got here." "I want to leave now." The urgency in his voice, the first true crack she'd seen in his composure, frightened her more than anything else that night. He didn't explain. He simply gathered her coat, murmured excuses to their hosts with a smile so perfectly manufactured it made her skin crawl, and walked her out through a side entrance flanked by 2 of his men, his hand never once leaving her waist, his eyes never once stopping their restless sweep of the shadows. In the car, speeding back through wet Roman streets, she finally asked, "Alessandro, what's happening? Who was that man?" He didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had dropped into something low and grim, a register she hadn't heard from him before, not the cool control of the boardroom, not the possessive warmth of the dance floor, but something that sounded unmistakably like fear. "Someone I owe a debt to," he said finally. "One I haven't finished paying." Volkov. The name from the ledger rose in her mind like something surfacing from black water. She didn't say it aloud, but she watched his hands, gripping the seat between them, white-knuckled, and understood that whatever danger lived in this marriage, it had not ended the night of her accident. It had only been waiting for her to wake up. The attack came 4 days later, in broad daylight, in the one place Alessandro had promised her was safe. She was in the private garden behind the penthouse, a walled courtyard 3 floors up, accessible only through the house, lush with lemon trees and a fountain that had been imported, Marta told her, from a villa outside Florence. When the first shot cracked through the afternoon quiet, and the terracotta planter beside her head exploded into dust and shards. She didn't remember deciding to move. Instinct took over where conscious thought failed, throwing her flat behind the fountain's stone lip as a second shot chipped marble inches from her shoulder, and she was screaming. She realized distantly that she was screaming when the garden door burst open and Alessandro came through it like something unleashed. A gun already in his hand, his face transformed into something she hadn't seen before and would never fully forget. Pure, focused, murderous intent, stripped of every ounce of the cool control he wore like armor in every other moment of his life. "Stay down." He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the rooftop across the narrow street where the shots had come from, and he fired twice, the sound obscene in the enclosed space, before dropping low and half carrying, half dragging her back through the door into the house, shielding her body with his own so completely that she felt, rather than saw, the moment a third bullet struck somewhere behind them. The heavy, wet thud of impact, the grunt he bit back, the sudden hitch in his stride. "You're hit." "It's nothing. Move." He shoved her through the door, slammed it, through the bolt, and only then, in the relative safety of the hallway, did he sag against the wall for half a second, one hand pressed to his shoulder, where blood was already blooming dark through his white shirt, before he straightened again, teeth gritted, and pulled her against his chest so hard the breath left her lungs. "Are you hurt? Delia, look at me. Are you hurt?" "No. Alessandro, you're bleeding." "I don't care." His hands framed her face, and for the first time since she'd woken in that unfamiliar bed, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't calculation or control or careful curated tenderness. She saw terror. Naked, total terror. The kind that strips a man down to something almost unrecognizable. "I don't care about the shoulder. Do you understand me? I have watched you die once already. I will not survive watching it a second time." The words landed strangely, out of joint with the moment, but before she could ask what he meant, Cesare and 3 other men were flooding the hallway, weapons drawn, shouting in rapid Italian, and Alessandro was pulling away from her, transforming in the span of a breath back into the cold commander she'd glimpsed at that first benefit, barking orders that sent men scattering to secure the perimeter. It took 2 hours for the house to be declared clear. It took another hour for the doctor, summoned privately, no ambulance, no police, a detail that chilled her more than the gunfire itself, to dig the bullet from Alessandro's shoulder in the study she'd been forbidden to enter, while Delia sat beside him, gripping his uninjured hand so tightly her knuckles ached. "You should be resting," he said, wincing as the doctor worked, sweat beading at his temple. "You almost died protecting me." "I would do it again." He said it simply, without drama, a fact stated rather than a declaration made, and somehow that plainness made it land harder than any grand romantic speech could have. I would do it 1,000 times, in every version of this life, in every world where you exist. That isn't hyperbole, Delia. It's arithmetic. There's no version of my survival that matters to me if it doesn't include yours. Who wants me dead? His eyes, when they met hers, were very old suddenly, tired in a way that had nothing to do with blood loss. No one wants you dead, he said. You're a message, a way of reaching me, of reminding me what I owe and what happens if I don't pay it.
The debt, she said. Volkov.
His head snapped up, and for one terrible second she thought she'd made a catastrophic mistake. The look on his face was not anger exactly, but something colder, something that made her understand viscerally for the first time that the man in front of her was capable of violence that had nothing to do with protection. Then it passed, and he only looked exhausted. How do you know that name? I found a ledger in your study. I wasn't trying to... It doesn't matter. He closed his eyes. You'd have learned it eventually. Everyone does, eventually, who lives in this house. He opened them again and found her hand and held it with a grip that trembled slightly, whether from blood loss or something else she couldn't say. There's a debt, yes.
From before you and I married. A debt of blood, not money. The kind that can't be paid off, only managed. Delayed. I have spent every day since our wedding trying to keep it from touching you. His jaw tightened. I failed today. That will not happen again. What kind of debt requires blood? He didn't answer. He simply lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles, with a tenderness so at odds with the blood-soaked bandages, the gunfire still ringing in her ears, the cold fury she'd seen in his eyes on the rooftop when he'd fired back, and said, so quietly she almost missed it, the kind I will die paying before I let it touch you again. She should have been afraid of him. Some rational, self-preserving part of her understood that she should have been afraid of the violence he'd shown, of the world he'd dragged her into without her consent or memory of consenting, of the danger that had followed her into a garden she'd been told was safe. Instead, watching him bleed for her, hearing the raw truth beneath his careful control, she felt something far more dangerous than fear. She felt herself falling for a man she didn't remember marrying and couldn't yet name the wrongness she felt every time she searched his face for the ghost of the man in that wedding photograph and found, instead, only the echo of someone almost, but not quite, the same. The weeks that followed the shooting changed something between them. Alessandro, recovering from a shoulder wound that should have kept a lesser man bedridden for a month, instead grew more present, not less, cancelling meetings she suspected he never cancelled for anything, appearing at breakfast in soft grey sweaters instead of his usual armour of black tailoring, teaching her, patiently and without mockery, to make the pasta his grandmother had apparently taught him decades ago, his hands guiding hers over the flour-dusted counter with a gentleness that felt, increasingly, less like performance and more like the truth of him breaking through whatever surface he usually kept polished for the world. "You're better at this than I remember," he said one evening, watching her fold dough with an ease her hands seemed to know, even though her mind didn't. "You keep saying things like that,
Like you're testing whether the old me is still in here somewhere. Maybe I am. He reached over, brushed a streak of flour from her cheekbone with his thumb, and the touch lingered a half-second longer than it needed to. Does it bother you? No, she admitted, and meant it. I think I like it, being someone new to you, even while you're grieving someone I can't remember being. Something crossed his face, quick, complicated, gone before she could name it. I'm not grieving, he said. I'm here, with you. That's all I want. It became easier, in those weeks, to believe him. He took her to the coast on a day when the water was so blue it looked painted, and held her hand on a cliffside path while the wind tried to steal her laughter out to sea, and told her, haltingly, as though the words cost him something, about his childhood. A mother who died young, a father who ruled with a fist instead of words, a brother he rarely spoke of, and never, she noticed, by name. He told her about the first time he'd seen her, at a gallery opening in Milan, how she'd argued with him about a painting he pretended to hate and secretly loved, how he'd bought it that same night without telling her, and hung it in a room she'd never been shown. Show me, she said. He hesitated, the smallest fracture in his composure, before he took her hand and led her to a room on the third floor she hadn't known existed, small and private, holding a single painting, an abstract wash of blues and greys that the longer she looked at it, resolved into the suggestion of two figures standing close, foreheads touching, indistinct enough to be anyone and specific enough, somehow, to feel unmistakably like them. I told you it was garish, he said quietly. You told me I had no soul. Did I? You said... He stopped. Something flickered behind his eyes, a hesitation that didn't match the easy warmth of the story. You said a man who couldn't see beauty in something imperfect didn't deserve to keep beautiful things. I bought it out of spite. I hung it here because I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd said. He looked at her, and the coldness she'd first woken to, the careful, blade-sharp control, was entirely absent from his face now, replaced by something so unguarded it made her chest ache. I have never deserved you, Delia. I want you to know that, whatever happens. I have never once deserved the thing you gave me by staying. That sounds like something you say to someone you think might leave. Everyone leaves, eventually. He said it lightly, but the words carried weight, an old wound worn smooth by handling. I've made my peace with the idea that you might too, someday, when you remember enough to understand why you shouldn't have married me in the first place. I only ask that when that day comes, you remember this, too, that I loved you the way I know how, which isn't gentle and isn't easy, and probably isn't enough. But it's real. It has always been real. She kissed him then, the first time she'd initiated it, weeks into a marriage that felt increasingly less like an inherited obligation and more like a life she was choosing, day by day, to want. He went utterly still for a heartbeat, as though bracing against a blow, before his hands found her waist and drew her in with a hunger so raw it stole the breath from her lungs. And when they finally broke apart, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing unsteady, he said very quietly, "Say you'll stay, even after you remember everything. Say you'll choose this." Choose me. I don't even know what I'd be choosing between, she said, laughing, breathless. There's no competition, Alessandro. There's only you. Something moved behind his eyes, relief so profound it looked almost like pain, and he kissed her again, harder this time, backing her against the wall beneath the painting of two figures with their foreheads touching, and for one perfect, unguarded stretch of time, Delia forgot every unanswered question that had followed her through this house like a shadow. She forgot the locked study, the ledger, the name Volkov, the wedding photograph with its smile too wide to be the man she knew. She only knew the certainty of his hands, the desperate honesty in his voice, and the terrifying, exhilarating fact that she was falling in love with a man she'd been told by every official record and every frightened member of his household that she had already married once before. A man whose face she wore like a memory just out of reach, and whose name, she was only beginning to suspect, might not be entirely his own. The memory came back in pieces, the way the doctor had warned it might. Not a flood, but a slow leak. Fragments surfacing at odd hours, with no warning and no order. Images without context that she had to hold up to the light of what she'd been told and try to make fit. It was 3 in the morning when the first real one arrived, sharp and total, jolting her upright in bed, gasping like a woman surfacing from deep water. A church. Candles. Her own hand in someone's hand, a ring being slid onto her finger. This ring, the black diamond, she recognized it even in the memory. And a voice speaking vows in a low, warm register entirely unlike the cool precision she'd grown used to hearing from Alessandro. She couldn't see his face in the memory, only the curve of his smile, wider and looser than anything she'd seen since waking, exactly the smile from the photograph in the study. And when he'd leaned down to kiss her, she remembered, with a certainty that made her chest ache, that his hand had cupped her jaw, and that beneath his thumb, tracing along his jawline, there had been a small, pale scar. Alessandro had no scar on his jaw. She lay awake beside him for the rest of the night, watching the ceiling, turning the memory over and over, like a coin she couldn't stop flipping, searching for an innocent explanation and finding none that fit. "You seem distracted," Alessandro said the next morning, watching her over his coffee with the particular attentiveness that had, in recent weeks, come to feel like devotion rather than surveillance. "I remembered our wedding," she said carefully, watching his face. "A little of it. The church. The vows." Something flared behind his eyes. Hope, unguarded and immediate. "What else? Delia, what else did you see? Just pieces. Your smile." She hesitated. "It was different. Bigger. And I remember a scar. Here." She touched her own jaw. "When you cupped my face." "But you don't have a scar there." The hope drained out of his expression so completely, so instantly, that she felt it like a physical thing, a temperature drop in the room. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone carefully, deliberately flat. "Memory is unreliable after trauma," he said. "The doctors told us this would happen. Fragments distorted, details borrowed from other memories and grafted onto ones that don't belong. It's not uncommon." It felt real. I'm sure it did. He set down his coffee with exaggerated care, as though his hands required conscious effort to control. I don't have a scar, Delia. You're remembering someone else, or something your mind has invented to fill the gaps. It happens. It was a reasonable explanation. It was, she told herself over the following days, probably the true one. And yet, something about the way he'd said it, the too careful evenness of his voice, the way his hand had trembled almost imperceptibly around his coffee cup, the fact that he would not meet her eyes for the rest of that particular breakfast, planted a seed of doubt that refused, no matter how she reasoned with it, to be uprooted. She began, after that, to watch him more closely. Not with suspicion, exactly. She told herself it wasn't suspicion, only the natural curiosity of a woman piecing together a life from fragments, but with an attentiveness that noticed things she hadn't noticed before. The way he sometimes hesitated, fractionally, before answering to his own name when someone called it across a crowded room, as though the syllables required a half-second of conscious translation before he claimed them. The way Marta, on the rare occasions she forgot herself, sometimes started to call him something else entirely, Signor D, before catching herself and correcting to Signor Ferrara, with a flush of panic that she covered, badly, with excessive apology. The way his handwriting, glimpsed once on a note left for Cesare, looked nothing like the looping, confident script in the old ledger she'd found in the study. A ledger she now suspected had not been written by the man currently sharing her bed. And there was the ring itself, his ring, the wedding band he wore on his left hand, which she noticed one evening, watching him pour wine, fit him slightly loose, slipping a fraction toward his knuckle whenever he lifted his glass, as though it had been sized for a hand not quite as broad as his. None of it, alone, meant anything. Grief distorts memory. Trauma changes handwriting. Weight loss loosens rings. She could explain away every single fragment, individually, with perfect rational ease. But together, accumulating night after night, like sediment settling at the bottom of a glass, they formed a shape she couldn't unsee once she'd noticed it. The shape of a man performing the role of her husband with such devoted, meticulous precision that she had almost failed to notice he was performing at all. She thought of Bianca's words at the benefit. "You're the one thing in this world that man has ever wanted more than power," and wondered, for the first time, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, whether Bianca had been talking about the man beside her at all, or whether she'd been talking about someone else entirely. Someone whose name Delia hadn't yet learned to fear. She found Bianca again 3 weeks later at a private gallery opening Alessandro had been unable to attend. Called away, he'd said, tight-jawed and apologetic, on urgent business he wouldn't name, and Delia went alone, flanked by Cesare at a discreet distance, drawn by an impulse she didn't fully understand until she saw Bianca across the room, and realized she'd been hoping, all along, to find her here. "You came without your keeper," Bianca said, sliding up beside her with 2 glasses of champagne, offering one without asking whether Delia wanted it. "Brave. Or foolish. With Alessandro it's often hard to tell the difference." "I need to ask you something," Delia said, "and I need you to be honest with me even if it's ugly." Bianca's carefully bored expression sharpened into something more alert. "That's a dangerous request to make in this city, sweetheart. You said we were close. Before. We were. Then tell me about my husband, the real one." Before the accident. Delia watched Bianca's face carefully, the way it stilled, the way her grip on her champagne glass tightened almost imperceptibly. Something's wrong, Bianca. I don't know what exactly, but something is wrong, and I think you know what it is. Bianca was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving over the room, checking exits, Delia realized, checking who might be listening, a habit that spoke of long practice in a world where careless words carried consequences. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. What do you remember about him? About the man before the accident? A scar along his jaw. A different smile. Warmer, somehow. Delia's throat tightened. He doesn't have the scar anymore, Bianca. Alessandro, my husband. He says my memory is confusing him with someone else. Bianca's face went white. Bianca, what is it? Not here. Bianca's hand closed around her wrist, urgent, and she was pulling Delia toward a private alcove at the edge of the gallery before Delia could protest, her eyes darting once more toward the door, toward Cesare's watchful silhouette. Delia, listen to me. I don't have long, and I need you to hear this without dismissing it as a jealous woman's spite, because I promise you, whatever you think of me, this isn't that. I'm listening. There were two of them. Bianca's voice shook, barely controlled. Twins, Alessandro and his brother. You never met the brother. Alessandro kept him hidden, sent away, said he was estranged, dangerous, unstable. I only knew because Alessandro told me himself, years ago, when we were... She waved the rest of the sentence away, impatient with her own history. The brother owed a blood debt, to the Volkov Bratva, from something he did years before you ever met Alessandro. Something catastrophic. Alessandro spent a fortune trying to keep it contained, keep his brother's mess from touching the family's name. Delia's blood had gone cold. What happened to the brother? I don't know exactly, but I know the accident that put you in that hospital bed wasn't an accident, Delia. And I know that when I saw Alessandro at that benefit, the man you were dancing with, something about him was wrong, different. I've known Alessandro Ferrara for 12 years. I know the way he laughs, the way he holds a glass, the particular arrogance in the way he enters a room like he already owns it. Her eyes were wet now, urgent. That man wasn't him, Delia. I'd bet my life on it. I think I am betting my life on it, telling you this. You're saying the man I married, the man I've been living with, is his brother. The words felt absurd, leaving her mouth, too much like the plot of a film to be real. And yet, even as she said them, every fragment she'd gathered over the past weeks slotted into place around the shape of it with sickening precision. The missing scar, the hesitation before his own name, Marta's slip of the tongue, the ring sized for a different hand. I'm saying you need to find out what happened to your real husband, Bianca said, gripping her hands now, urgent and pale, before whoever is wearing his name finds out that you're starting to remember the truth. Because Delia, if I'm right, if that man really is who I think he has already killed once to take his brother's life. I don't think he'll hesitate to protect it a second time. Even from you. Across the gallery, Cesare had noticed their absence and was moving toward them, his face carefully neutral, his eyes sharp with the particular alertness of a man reporting, later, everything he'd witnessed. Bianca released Delia's hands and stepped back, her composure sliding back into place like a mask retrieved just in time.
"Find the truth quietly," she murmured, already turning away, already reassembling herself into the bored socialite the room expected to see. "And Delia, for what it's worth, I don't think he's lying about loving you. I think that might be the most dangerous part of all of this. A man who loves you enough to kill his own brother for the chance to keep you isn't a man who'll let you walk away once he knows you've seen through him." She was gone before Delia could ask anything else, swallowed by the crowd, leaving Delia standing alone in the alcove with Cesare approaching and a truth unfolding inside her chest like something breaking, slow and irrevocable that she didn't yet know how to survive. She waited until he left for what he called a meeting downtown. 3 hours, he'd told her, maybe 4, his kiss at the door lingering a beat too long, as though some part of him sensed the shift in her since the gallery and was trying wordlessly to anchor her back to him before he left. And then she went straight to the study. The desk drawer was still locked. This time she didn't hesitate to force it. She found a letter opener in the study's second drawer and worked it into the lock with the clumsy, adrenaline-fueled determination of a woman who has decided that whatever consequences await her are worth the price of finally knowing the truth. The lock gave with a splintering crack that seemed, in the silence of the empty house, obscenely loud. Inside, papers. A birth certificate. 2 names, side by side, born 4 minutes apart. Alessandro Dante Ferrara. Dante Alessandro Ferrara. Twins, their names mirrored into each other with a cruelty that felt now almost prophetic. A death certificate, dated 6 weeks before her accident. Alessandro Dante Ferrara. Cause of death, gunshot wound. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the papers. Beneath the death certificate, a folder of photographs. Surveillance photographs, grainy and long-lensed, of 2 men who looked identical except for the scar along one man's jaw, meeting in what looked like a warehouse, arguing, the body language unmistakably hostile, even frozen in still images. And beneath those, a letter, handwritten, the paper soft with age and handling, as though it had been read and reread 100 times. "Dante, I know what you're planning. I know about the Volkov debt, and I know you think this is the only way out. I'm asking you, brother to brother, not to do this. She doesn't deserve to be a pawn in whatever you're building. If you take my name, you take my life, and I won't let you take her too." It was signed simply Alessandro. Delia sank into the desk chair, the letter trembling in her hands, and understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that everything Bianca had told her was true. The man sleeping beside her every night, the man whose hands had learned every inch of her over the past weeks, the man who had bled for her in that garden and told her with such raw and convincing sincerity that he would die 1,000 times to protect her, that man was not her husband. Her husband was dead, had been dead for 6 weeks before she'd even woken from her accident. Murdered, if the letter's warning and the timeline of the death certificate were to be believed, by his own twin brother, who had then assumed his identity so completely, so thoroughly, that he had walked into a hospital room and claimed a grieving, amnesiac widow as his wife, without so much as a flicker of hesitation. "I have watched you die once already," he'd told her.
that day in the hallway after the shooting, blood soaking through his shirt. I will not survive watching it a second time. She had thought, at the time, that he was speaking in metaphor. Now she understood, with a horror so total it felt like something physical, a hand closing around her throat, that he had meant it literally. He had watched his brother die. Perhaps he had been the one to kill him. And then he had taken everything his brother had, his name, his empire, his house, his wife, and worn it like a second skin, so seamlessly that even the woman who had married the original man could not, for weeks, tell the difference. A sound in the hallway. Footsteps, unmistakable, unhurried, sent ice through her veins. She shoved the papers back into the drawer with shaking hands, but there was no time to force the lock closed again, no time to erase the splintered wood where she'd broken it. The study door opened. Dante, she made herself think the name now, made herself unlearn the lie she'd been living inside for weeks, stood in the doorway. And the moment his eyes found the broken lock, found her sitting at the desk, with guilt written across every line of her face. Something in his expression shattered and reformed into something far colder, far more dangerous than anything she'd seen from him before. "You went in the drawer," he said. His voice was very quiet. That, more than shouting could have, told her exactly how much danger she was in. "Alessandro is dead." Her own voice came out steadier than she felt, though her heart was slamming against her ribs hard enough to hurt. "You killed him. You've been lying to me since the moment I woke up." He didn't deny it. He didn't move from the doorway. He simply looked at her, and something in his silver eyes, eyes she now understood belonged to a man whose name she'd never actually learned, cracked open into a grief so raw, so total, that for a moment she almost forgot to be afraid. "I didn't kill him," he said finally, his voice breaking on the words. "God, Delia, I didn't. But I might as well have. And I don't expect you to believe there's a difference." "Then tell me the truth, all of it, right now." He closed the study door behind him with a soft final click, and in the silence that followed, Delia understood that whatever answer he gave her next would either save what had grown between them over the past weeks, or destroy it, and possibly her, entirely. "My name is Dante Ferrara," he said. "Alessandro was my twin. 4 minutes older, and he never let me forget it. The eldest, the heir, the one our father groomed to inherit everything, while I was groomed to be useful, expendable, a spare, in case the heir ever failed." He crossed to the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. "I loved him. I need you to understand that first, before anything else. Whatever I've done, whatever I am, I loved my brother more than I have loved almost anything in this world." "Then why—" "Let me finish." His voice cracked just slightly on the words. 10 years ago, before Alessandro ever met you, I made a mistake that nearly destroyed our family. A shipment went wrong. I won't bore you with the details, but the short version is that I stole from the Volkov Bratva to cover a debt of my own, and I was caught. And the price for that theft was set at an amount no honest business could ever pay. Alessandro covered it, every cent. He never told our father, he never told anyone. He simply absorbed the debt as his own and spent the next decade paying it down, piece by piece, protecting me from consequences I'd earned and he hadn't. "That's not the same as what you did to him." "No," he agreed quietly. "It isn't." He turned back to face her, and the grief on his face was unmistakably real. Whatever else about him, had proven false. 6 weeks before your accident, the Volkov made their final demand. Not money. Money was never going to satisfy them anymore. They wanted blood. Mine, specifically, for the theft I'd committed 10 years earlier, which they'd only recently traced back to me instead of Alessandro. His hands clenched at his sides. Alessandro found out. He came to me, furious, terrified, trying to find a way to save me the way he'd been saving me my entire life. We argued. I told him I would turn myself over to them rather than let him spend one more year of his life cleaning up my mistakes.
And instead? Instead, 3 men came for me at a meeting I thought was private. Alessandro's men, not mine. He'd sent them, though I didn't understand that until later. Sent them to protect me without telling me, the way he always protected me without telling me, because that was who he was. Dante's voice had gone hollow. There was a firefight. I still don't know exactly how it happened. I was shot. I went down. When I came to, Alessandro was on the ground beside me, and he wasn't moving. And there was so much blood, Delia. There was so much blood, I couldn't tell whose it was. His hands were shaking now, visibly, the composed mask he wore for the rest of the world entirely gone. He took the bullet meant for me. My brother, the golden son, the heir, the one our father actually wanted, died on a warehouse floor covering for a mistake I made a decade ago, the same way he'd covered for every mistake I'd ever made. A ragged breath. And in that moment, with him dying in my arms and Volkov's men already regrouping to finish what they'd started, I made a decision I will spend the rest of my life questioning. I told my men that I was Alessandro, that the man on the ground was Dante, the useless spare, expendable, no great loss to anyone. I let them believe they'd killed the wrong brother. Why? Because Alessandro built an empire that 100 families depend on for their livelihood. Because our father would have disowned the truth entirely rather than admit his golden son had died protecting his failure of a spare. Because the Volkov debt died with the man who owed it, and if Delia Ferrara was dead, they had no further claim on anyone. His eyes found hers, raw and pleading. And because you were in a hospital bed 3 miles away, in a coma, having crashed your car, racing to reach him when you heard about the shooting, and I could not let you wake up to the news that your husband was dead. I told myself it was to protect you. I've told myself that every day for 6 weeks. I don't know anymore if that's true, or if I simply couldn't bear the thought of losing both of you in the same week. My brother to a bullet, and you to grief you'd have carried for the rest of your life. So you became him. I became him, Dante confirmed, and his voice broke entirely on the words. I learned his signatures. I studied his mannerisms, the ones I hadn't already absorbed just from growing up in his shadow. I moved into his house, wore his rings, answered to his name, and then you woke up, with no memory of the accident, no memory of the man you'd actually married. And I told myself the kindest lie of my life, that letting you fall in love with me instead of grieving him was a mercy. That I could give you the marriage he would have wanted you to have if he couldn't be the one to give it to you himself. He crossed the room, stopped a foot away from her, close enough that she could see the tears he was fighting not to shed. I have hated myself every single day for the lie, and I have not, for 1 single hour, been able to make myself regret falling in love with you inside it.
Both of those things are true, Delia. I don't know how to reconcile them, and I don't expect you to forgive me for not trying harder. Delia stared at him, at this man who was not her husband and had never been her husband, who had built an elaborate architecture of lies out of grief and desperation, and apparently a love he hadn't asked for and couldn't stop, and felt something in her chest tear apart along a fault line she hadn't known existed. "I fell in love with you," she said quietly. "Not him. You. The man who taught me to make pasta and cried at a painting he pretended to hate and bled in a hallway telling me he'd rather die than let anything happen to me." Her voice shook. "But you let me believe I was falling in love with my husband. You let me mourn a version of a marriage that was never real, while the actual grief I owed, for a man who died loving me enough to take a bullet meant for his own brother, you took that from me too. You didn't just steal his name, Dante. You stole my right to grieve him." "I know." His voice was barely a whisper. "I know, and I am so sorry. And I understand if that isn't enough. It was never going to be enough. I think some part of me has known that since the day you woke up and looked at me like I was a stranger. Because I was. I am. Whatever you feel for me, it was built on a lie. And I don't know how a person builds anything real on ground that unstable." Somewhere below them, in the courtyard, a car door slammed, sharp, sudden, wrong in a house where every arrival was usually announced ahead of time by the gate guards. Dante's head snapped toward the window, every trace of grief instantly subsumed beneath something harder, more alert. "Stay here," he said, already moving toward the door, already reaching for the weapon he kept in the study's second drawer. "Dante, that's not going to work." His voice had gone flat, urgent. "Whoever's downstairs isn't announced, which means they're not supposed to be here." He turned back at the door, and for one raw moment the mask fell away entirely, leaving only a man terrified of losing the last thing he had left. "Whatever you decide about me, whatever you decide about us, about tonight, about everything I've just told you, I need you to survive it, to decide it. Please, stay here, lock the door, and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." He was gone before she could argue, and Delia sat alone in the study with a broken lock, a folder of photographs that had unmade her entire understanding of her own life, and the dawning, terrible realization that the danger Bianca had warned her about had just arrived at the front door. The gunfire started before she'd even reached the door to lock it. Delia froze, hand on the handle, listening to the chaos erupting through the house below, shouting in Russian-accented Italian, the heavy percussion of automatic fire, Cesare's voice barking orders that cut off abruptly in a way that made her stomach drop. She thought of the ledger, the name underlined 3 times. "He will come for what is owed, and he will not care whose name is on the door when he does." They'd found out. Somehow, the truth Bianca had warned might get someone killed had reached the one family capable of ending this entire charade with a single, brutal correction. She locked the door, as instructed, and then, heart-hammering, she did the only thing that felt survivable. She moved to the study's second, smaller door, the one that connected to a narrow servants' passage Marta had shown her weeks ago during an aimless afternoon tour, and slipped through it into the dark. The passage ran the length of the house's east wing, cramped and unlit, and she followed it by memory and touch, flinching at every burst of gunfire that echoed up through the walls, praying with an intensity she hadn't felt since childhood that Dante, she still didn't know what to call him, even now, even with bullets flying through the house he'd stolen, was alive somewhere below her. She emerged into a linen closet on the second floor, breathless, and nearly screamed when a hand closed over her mouth from behind. "It's me," Bianca's voice, urgent and low, close to her ear. "Delia, don't make a sound. I came the second I heard. Cesare called me, said there was movement outside the gates, and I knew they'd finally traced it." "Where's Alessandro?" Delia caught herself. "Dante. Where's Dante?" "Downstairs, trying to hold the east entrance." Bianca's face was pale, her usual composure entirely stripped away. "Delia, listen to me. Pyotr Volkov doesn't negotiate. If he's here himself, it means he already knows the truth, that Dante's been wearing his brother's name for 6 weeks. And that means this isn't about money anymore, or even about the old debt.
It's about the insult. A man who fakes his own brother's death to escape a blood debt is a man Volkov will want to make an example of, publicly, brutally, to make sure no one else in this world gets the idea that identity can be a shield against what's owed. What do? We get you out. Bianca was already moving, pulling Delia toward the servants' stairwell at the end of the corridor. "There's a car in the west garage, my car. They won't be watching for it. I'll get you to the airport, get you somewhere safe, and Dante can—" "No." The word came out of Delia with a certainty that surprised her, cutting through her own fear like a blade. "I'm not leaving him to die down there." "Delia, he lied to you. He let you fall in love with a dead man's life. You don't owe him—" "I know what he did." Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. "I know exactly what he did, and God help me, I am furious with him, and I don't know if I can ever fully forgive it. But he took a bullet for me in that garden, without a single second of hesitation, Bianca. He has spent 6 weeks trying to protect me from a truth that was tearing him apart to keep hidden. Whatever else is true, that man down there loves me in a way I don't think I've ever been loved before, real name or not. I am not going to let him die alone because I was too proud or too hurt to go back for him." Bianca stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Surprise, and beneath it, a grudging, complicated respect. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the stupidest," she said finally. "Possibly both." "Fine, but we do this smart, not reckless. There's a gun cabinet in the west hallway. Alessandro kept it stocked for exactly this kind of night, and I doubt Dante's changed the combination. Can you shoot?" "I don't know," Delia admitted. "I don't remember." "Then you're about to find out." Bianca's jaw set, hard and determined. "Let's go get your husband back, whichever one he turns out to actually be." They moved through the dark house together, following the sound of gunfire toward the east entrance, and Delia felt something crystallize inside her chest with each step. Not the confused, amnesiac uncertainty that had defined every day since she'd woken in that unfamiliar bed, but something clean and sharp and absolutely her own. She didn't remember the woman she'd been before the accident. She didn't know if that woman would have recognized any of this, the gun cabinet, the danger, the fierce and terrifying resolve currently propelling her toward gunfire instead of away from it. But she knew, with a certainty that needed no memory to support it,
that whatever else was true or false about the last 2 months of her life, her feelings for the man fighting for his life 2 floors below her were entirely, irrevocably real. She reached the top of the east staircase in time to see Dante go down. He wasn't dead. She registered that first, with a relief so violent it nearly buckled her knees. He was down, one hand pressed to a wound at his side, dragging himself behind an overturned table as return fire chewed splinters from the marble around him. But he was alive, cursing in Italian, reloading a weapon with hands that were shaking from blood loss and adrenaline both.
3 men had breached the east entrance. Cesare was down near the doorway, unmoving, and grief for a man she'd known only 2 months tore through Delia, even as she registered with cold, clinical horror that whoever remained standing would decide whether any of them survived the next 60 seconds. "Delia, get down!" Dante's voice, hoarse and furious, spotted her on the staircase before she'd even fully processed the tactical horror of the room below. "Get down! Get back!" She didn't get back. Bianca was already moving, low and fast, toward the gun cabinet in the west alcove, and Delia, some instinct older than memory taking hold, some muscle-deep knowledge her body seemed to possess even when her mind had forgotten everything else, dropped to a crouch and followed, adrenaline burning through her veins like fire. The cabinet's combination gave on Bianca's second try. She pressed a pistol into Delia's shaking hands, checked the magazine of her own with brisk, practiced efficiency, and said, low and urgent, "Aim for the center of the body. Don't think about it. Thinking gets people killed." Below, the exchange of fire had intensified. Delia caught a glimpse of the man who had to be Pyotr Volkov himself, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, moving through the chaos with the unhurried calm of a man who had survived 100 nights like this one and expected to survive 100 more. Directing his men with sharp, economical gestures, his pale eyes scanning the staircase with an unnerving, patient thoroughness that suggested he already knew exactly who he was looking for. Delia Ferrara. Volkov's voice carried through the wrecked entryway, calm and almost pleasant, the voice of a man discussing weather rather than blood debts. "You wear your brother's name well. I'll give you that much credit. But a stolen name doesn't erase what's owed underneath it, does it? Come out, and perhaps I let the woman live. Continue hiding, and I promise you, I will burn this entire house to find you both. Let her go, and I'll come to you myself." Dante's voice, from behind the overturned table, had gone hard as flint, stripped of every trace of the tenderness she'd heard in it over the past weeks. "She has nothing to do with this. She didn't even know the truth until an hour ago." A touching offer, also irrelevant. Volkov's men were fanning out, methodically, closing the distance toward the table where Dante was pinned. "You see, Signor Ferrara, or should I say, Signor Ferrara's brother, the debt was never really about the money, or even the theft. It was about respect. And a man who fakes his own brother's death and steals his life to hide from what he owes has shown my family precisely none. I intend to correct that impression thoroughly, publicly, so that every family from here to Palermo understands that debts to the Volkov cannot be outrun by simply changing one's name." Delia's hands were steady on the pistol grip, steadier than she expected, steadier, she thought distantly, than the woman she'd been before the accident might have managed. She thought of Alessandro's letter, the one she'd found in the drawer, warning his brother not to take this path. She thought of the death certificate,
The surveillance photographs, the 6 weeks of careful, devastating lies built on a foundation of grief neither brother had ever deserved to carry alone. And she thought of Dante's hands, gentle over hers while they made pasta, his voice breaking as he told her the truth in that study an hour ago, the terror in his eyes when he'd said, "I have watched you die once already." She raised the pistol, braced against the stair railing the way some deep, wordless instinct told her to, and when the nearest of Volkov's men rounded the base of the staircase, weapon already swinging toward Dante's position, she fired. The recoil punched up through her arms, shocking and total, and the man dropped, and the world seemed to slow into something clear and terrible and absolutely focused. Bianca fired beside her, taking down a second man with a precision that spoke of far more practice than Delia's own lucky shot. Below, Dante used the momentary chaos to surge up from behind the table, firing with a cold efficiency that finally, entirely, revealed the man beneath the careful domestic warmth of the past 2 months. A man who had clearly killed before and would clearly kill again, without hesitation, for the people he'd decided belonged to him. Volkov, watching his men fall, did not panic. He simply raised his own weapon, sighted with unhurried precision, and aimed. Not at Dante, Delia realized with a scream already tearing out of her throat, but at her. Dante moved faster than thought. The shot that should have taken her in the chest instead caught him high in the back as he threw himself into its path, and he went down hard at the base of the staircase. And Delia was screaming his name and half falling down the stairs toward him before Bianca's restraining hand could catch her, before the sound of sirens, distant, growing louder, someone in the surrounding houses having finally called the police, despite the family's usual careful discretion, sent Volkov's remaining men scrambling for the exits, their employer's cold voice snapping orders to retreat, to regroup, to finish this another night. She reached Dante as the last of the gunfire died into ringing silence, and found him conscious, barely, blood spreading dark and fast across the marble beneath him, his silver eyes finding hers with an expression of such profound, wondering tenderness that it broke something open in her chest entirely. "You came back," he whispered, disbelieving, as she pressed both hands hard against the wound in a desperate, fumbling attempt to stop the bleeding. "After everything I told you, you came back for me." "Shut up," she sobbed, hands slick with his blood. "Shut up and stay alive, you absolute idiot. You don't get to die now, not after everything." "Delia." His hand found her wrist, weak but insistent, holding on with the last of whatever strength he had left. "Whatever happens, I need you to know. Everything I felt for you these past weeks, that was never the lie. That was the one true thing in the middle of everything false. I love you, not because you're his wife, because you're you. Because somewhere between the pasta and the painting and the garden, I stopped being a man wearing my brother's life and started being a man who simply, hopelessly, belongs to you." "Don't you dare say goodbye to me," she said fiercely, pressing harder against the wound as the sirens grew louder outside. "Don't you dare. We're going to survive this, both of us. And then you're going to spend the rest of your life making up for every single lie. Do you understand me?" His mouth curved, faint and pained, into something that was almost a smile. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured. And then his eyes fluttered closed, and Delia screamed for help into a house filled with sirens and blood and the wreckage of every lie that had brought them both to this exact, terrible, transformative moment. He survived, barely, the doctors said. The bullet had missed his spine by less than a centimetre, had nicked a lung, had cost him nearly 2 litres of blood before the private surgical team Cesare's second-in-command had summoned managed to stabilise him on an operating table set up, out of necessity and caution, in the mansion's own basement rather than risk the exposure of a hospital. Delia sat beside his bed for 3 days, watching the machines chart his slow, stubborn climb back toward consciousness, and used the enforced stillness to finally fully understand the shape of the truth she'd uncovered. Bianca stayed too, in those days, an unexpected, complicated presence, alternating between fierce practical competence, fielding calls, coordinating with the surgical team, keeping the household's fragile morale from shattering entirely, and long silences during which Delia caught her watching Dante's unconscious form with an expression she couldn't quite decode. "You loved him," Delia said on the second night, when exhaustion had worn down whatever diplomatic instinct might otherwise have kept the question unasked. Alessandro not just knew him, loved him. Bianca didn't deny it. A long time ago, before you. It ended badly. He chose the empire over anything softer, the way men like him usually do, and I told myself I'd made my peace with it. She was quiet a moment, her eyes still on Dante's still face. I didn't expect it to hurt this much, watching his brother almost die in his place. I think some part of me has been in love with both of them for years, if I'm honest, and never let myself examine that too closely, because it felt like a betrayal of the one who actually wanted me. "Do you think less of me?" Delia asked, "for loving him, knowing what he did?" Bianca considered the question with unexpected seriousness. "I think grief makes people do extraordinary, terrible things," she said finally. "I think a man who lies to protect someone he loves from unbearable pain is different from a man who lies for his own gain. Not innocent, not forgivable without cost, but different. And I think you're allowed to hold both truths at once. That what he did to you was a violation, and that what grew between you anyway was real." Life rarely offers us clean moral categories, Delia. Mostly, it just offers us people, doing their damaged best, and asks us to decide what we can live with. On the third night, Dante's eyes opened. "Delia." His voice was a rasp, barely audible. But his hand found hers with immediate, desperate strength. "You're still here. Where else would I be?" "I thought—" He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "I thought you'd have left. After everything. I wouldn't have blamed you." "I very nearly did," she admitted, threading her fingers through his, feeling the fragile, wonderful pulse of him beneath her palm. "I sat in that study, with your brother's death certificate in my hands, and I hated you, Dante. I hated you so completely I could barely breathe through it. And then I heard gunfire, and every rational, self-protective instinct I had told me to run, to save myself, to let Volkov settle whatever debt he thought he was owed without involving me in the cost of it." Her voice broke, and instead I went and got a gun and shot a man for the first time in my life because the thought of losing you was somehow worse than every lie you'd told me. I don't fully understand that. I've had 3 days to sit with it, and I still don't fully understand it. I understand it, he said quietly. It's called loving someone, despite every reason not to. I've been doing it since the day you woke up and looked at me like a stranger, and I decided, God help me, that I would rather live inside a lie with you than live in the truth without you. His grip on her hand tightened. That was selfish. I know it was selfish. I took something from you that wasn't mine to take. Your grief. Your right to mourn the man you actually married. Your consent to fall in love with someone whose real name you didn't even know. I have no defense for that, Delia. I'm not going to insult you by pretending I do. Then what do you have? She asked, if not a defense? An offer. His eyes, silver and exhausted, and entirely unguarded, held hers. The truth, from here forward, no matter how much it costs me. My real name, spoken aloud in every room, to everyone, starting with my father, who is going to disown me the moment he learns what I did to preserve his precious empire. Volkov. Dealt with honestly, on my own terms, under my own name, so that whatever debt is finally settled is settled by the man who actually owes it, not by a stolen identity that was always going to collapse eventually. He drew a ragged breath. And you, Delia, if you'll still have me, once the dust settles, once you've had time to grieve the man I let you believe you married. Not because I expect you to forgive everything overnight, because I intend to spend as many years as you'll let me proving that the man underneath the lie was always worth staying for. Delia sat with his hand in hers, the machines beeping their steady rhythm beside them, and felt the truth of her own heart settle into something she could finally name without flinching. I'm still angry, she said. I want you to know that. I think I'll be angry for a long time, and I think that's allowed. And I don't want you to try to talk me out of it every time it surfaces. I won't. But I love you, she continued, and the words, once spoken aloud, felt like a door finally opened rather than a confession dragged unwillingly into the light. Not the idea of my husband, not the name on your driver's license. You, Dante Ferrara, the man who cried at a painting and bled in a garden and told me the truth even when it cost him everything he'd built to hide it. She leaned down, pressed her forehead to his the way she'd seen in that painting weeks ago, 2 figures caught in an intimacy too specific to belong to anyone else. So yes, when the dust settles, I'll still have you. He exhaled, something in his chest loosening that had nothing to do with the wound beneath his bandages, and for the first time since the gunfire had torn through the house, Delia allowed herself to believe that they might actually survive this. Not just the bullet, not just the Volkov debt still hanging unresolved over both their heads, but the truth itself, laid bare between them at last, with nothing left to hide. She didn't yet know how much the coming weeks would test that belief. Dante's recovery took another 2 weeks, during which the household existed in a strange, suspended state. Volkov's threat unresolved, the truth of Dante's identity still contained within the walls of the mansion and the small circle who already knew it, and looming over everything, the summons that arrived on the 9th day. A meeting requested, in terms that left no room for refusal, by Salvatore Ferrara, Dante's father. He knows, Dante said grimly, reading the letter Cesare had delivered with visible unease. Someone talked. Volkov, probably, spreading the story to weaken us before he strikes again. There's no strategic reason to keep the truth quiet anymore, not once he's decided to make an example of me. My father wants to see his son. He doesn't specify which one he expects to find. Do you have to go? If I don't, he'll come here, and I would rather face him on ground I can control, if any ground in this remains controllable at all. He caught her hand, still recovering enough that the motion cost him visible effort. Come with me. Are you sure? He might do any number of terrible things, Dante said, with the flat, resigned honesty of a man who had spent his entire life bracing against a parent's disappointment. But I am done facing this family alone, hiding behind a dead man's name. If I'm going to be Dante Ferrara again, publicly, permanently, I want to start by standing in front of my father as exactly that. And I want you beside me when I do it. The Ferrara family estate sat an hour outside Rome, a sprawling compound behind gates that made even the penthouse look modest, and Salvatore Ferrara received them in a study lined with portraits of Ferrara men going back generations, all of them sharing the same sharp jaw, the same cold, assessing eyes that Delia now recognized with a jolt in both Dante's face and the wedding photograph of his dead brother. So, Salvatore did not rise from his desk. He looked between them with an expression carved from granite, betraying nothing. The stories are true, then. My son is dead, and the spare has been wearing his skin for 2 months. Alessandro died protecting me, Dante said, his voice steady, despite the visible tension coiled through every line of his body. I made a decision in the chaos of that night that I have spent every day since regretting and defending in equal measure. I'm not here to ask your forgiveness, Father. I'm here to tell you the truth myself, before Volkov's version of it reaches you, filtered through someone who wants to use it against this family. You let the world believe my heir was dead, and my failure was the one who lived to inherit everything he built. I let the world believe a lie that protected this family's name and severed a debt that would have followed Alessandro's memory forever if the truth had come out immediately. Dante's jaw tightened. I'm not proud of it, but I would remind you, Father, that the debt in question was one I incurred, that Alessandro spent a decade quietly absorbing to protect this family from exactly the kind of shame you're expressing right now. If you want someone to blame for a Ferrara owing blood to the Volkov, you might look in a mirror at the man who taught his sons that mistakes were unforgivable and watch what that lesson produces when it's finally tested. Silence, thick and dangerous, filled the study. Delia held her breath, watching the old man's face for some crack in the granite, and found, eventually, something that might have been the ghost of it, a flicker of grief, quickly suppressed, quickly buried beneath the same cold control that had apparently defined this family for generations. Your brother, Salvatore said finally, was worth 10 of you. I know, Dante said quietly without flinching. He told me the same thing, in different words, more times than I can count. He never once let it stop him from loving me anyway. I have spent every day since his death trying, badly, to be worthy of that. He drew a breath. I'm not asking you to love me the way you loved him, Father. I know that's not possible, and I've made peace with it. I'm asking you to let me settle the Volkov debt under my own name, publicly, so that whatever consequences follow, follow the man who actually earned them, and not the ghost of the son you actually wanted. Salvatore's eyes moved slowly, deliberately, to Delia. And the wife, does she know what she's chosen? A man who will likely die paying a debt that should have been settled a decade ago? I know exactly what I've chosen, Delia said, before Dante could answer for her, her voice steadier than she expected. I watched him take a bullet meant for me without a single second of hesitation. I watched him tell the truth to you today, knowing it might cost him everything, including whatever relationship remains between the two of you. I don't need you to approve of us, Signor Ferrara. I only wanted you to hear, from me directly, that whatever you think of your son's choices, I do not regret loving him, not for one single day. Something shifted in the old man's face. Not warmth exactly, but a grudging, complicated respect that softened the granite by some small, measurable degree. You have your mother's spine, he said to Dante gruffly, and something in the observation carried more tenderness than anything he'd said since they'd entered the room. She would have liked her, Delia. A pause. Deal with Volkov, publicly, under your own name, as you've said. I'll provide what resources the family can offer without appearing weak in the doing of it. But know this, if you fail, if you drag this family's name through a war you can't win, I will not shield you the way your brother did. You'll face the consequences alone, exactly as you should have faced the debt a decade ago. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to warmth. But it was, Delia understood, watching Dante's shoulders loosen fractionally, the first true acknowledgement his father had offered him in longer than she suspected either man could remember. And as they left the estate an hour later, the autumn light slanting gold across the gravel drive, Dante's hand found hers, with a grip that spoke of gratitude too large for words. Thank you, he said quietly, as the car pulled through the gates. For staying, for standing there, and meaning every word. I did mean it, Delia said, resting her head against his shoulder, careful of the still healing wound beneath his shirt. Every word. But Dante, the debt, what does settling it actually look like? What happens now? His silence, stretching a beat too long before he answered, told her everything she needed to know about how dangerous the answer truly was. Volkov wants a meeting, Dante said, 3 days later, setting his phone down on the breakfast table with the careful precision of a man handling something explosive. Neutral ground, just the two of us, and whatever security detail each side brings. He's willing to discuss terms. Terms for what, exactly? For settling this without further bloodshed. Dante rubbed a hand over his jaw, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. Volkov is old world, in his way. He respects debts paid honestly more than he respects violence for its own sake. The attack on the house wasn't really about killing me, Delia, or you. It was a message, delivered the only language men like him fully trust. Force. Applied precisely enough to demonstrate seriousness without yet escalating to something neither side could walk back from. If I go to him under my real name, offer to settle the original debt with interest on terms he sets, there's a chance, a real chance, that this ends without more bloodshed. And if there isn't a chance? If he decides the insult of the deception outweighs whatever terms you offer? Then I go anyway, Dante said simply. Because the alternative is letting this hang over both our heads indefinitely, waiting for the next attack, the next attempt on your life used as leverage against mine. I would rather face it directly, on terms I can at least attempt to negotiate, than wait in this house for the next bullet to find you instead of me. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. The refusal came instant, hard, the first genuinely angry thing she'd heard from him since he'd woken from surgery. Delia, this is precisely the kind of danger I have spent 2 months trying to keep you away from. Volkov's interest in you exists entirely because of your connection to me. Walking you into a room with him voluntarily would be my choice, she cut in, matching his intensity with her own. You don't get to decide unilaterally which risks I'm allowed to take for the people I love. You already tried protecting me through secrecy, Dante, and look how that turned out. I nearly lost you anyway, and I spent 2 months building a life on a foundation you'd hollowed out without telling me. I am done being protected by exclusion. If you're walking into danger, I want to at least understand what's happening, be present for the decisions that affect both our lives, rather than waiting in this house for news that might arrive too late to matter. He stared at her for a long moment, something in his expression warring visibly between the fierce protective instinct that seemed woven into his very bones and a dawning, reluctant respect for the steel she'd shown him again and again since the moment she'd chosen to come back for him instead of fleeing with Bianca. "You're not coming into the room with Volkov," he said finally. "That's not negotiable, Delia, and if you fight me on it, I will have Cesare physically restrain you if necessary, because some risks are not romantic gestures of solidarity, they are simply reckless, and I refuse to let you take them." His voice gentled, fractionally. "But you can come. Wait nearby, with Cesare and enough of our own men to respond if something goes wrong. Be present for the outcome, whatever it is. That much I can agree to." It was, Delia understood, the furthest he was willing to bend, and she recognized, with a clarity that surprised her, that his refusal came not from a desire to control her, but from a genuine terror of losing her. The same terror that had sent him diving into gunfire without hesitation, the same terror that had driven him disastrously to lie about his own identity rather than let her wake into unbearable grief. Understanding the shape of his fear didn't erase her anger at the choices it had produced, but it made the anger easier to hold alongside something gentler, something that looked, increasingly, like forgiveness she hadn't fully decided to grant yet, but could feel taking root anyway. "Fine," she said. "I'll wait nearby. But Dante, if something goes wrong in that room, I am not going to sit quietly outside while you bleed out on Volkov's floor. I already made that mistake calculus once, in that hallway after the garden shooting, and once was enough to teach me I'm not built for patient waiting when your life is on the line." "I know," he said, something warm and helpless moving through his exhausted eyes. "God help me. I know exactly what you're capable of when you decide protecting me matters more than your own safety. It terrifies me, and it is, without question, the single most attractive thing about you." He pulled her close, pressed a kiss to her temple, lingering there, as though memorizing the shape of the moment against whatever came next. 3 days. The meeting is set for 3 days from now at a restaurant in Trastevere. Volkov apparently considers neutral ground. Until then, I want every hour we have, whatever happens after. Delia understood, in the way he said it, in the particular desperate tenderness of his hands as they moved over her that night, that he was preparing for the possibility of not walking out of that meeting alive. Settling accounts, in his own quiet way, with everything he'd built and everything he stood to lose. So that whatever happened in 3 days, he would have no regrets left unaddressed in the time remaining. She held him through the night, memorizing him in turn, and did not tell him about the plan already forming in her own mind. One that had nothing to do with waiting quietly outside a restaurant while the man she loved walked alone into a room with a man who had already tried to have her killed once. She had come back for him once already, gun in hand, when every rational instinct told her to run. She had no intention of simply waiting this time either. The restaurant Volkov had chosen occupied a quiet corner of Trastevere, unassuming from the street, the kind of place that survived on decades of loyal local patronage rather than tourist traffic. The perfect neutral ground, Delia understood, watching from a car parked half a block away, with Cesare tense and watchful beside her, for men who valued discretion above spectacle. Dante had gone in 10 minutes earlier, flanked by 2 of his most trusted men, his jaw set in the particular grim composure she'd come to recognize as the mask he wore when the stakes were highest and the fear beneath it most acute. He'd kissed her before he left the car, hard, brief, desperate, and told her, once more, to stay put, to trust Cesare's judgment if anything went wrong, to remember that whatever happened in that restaurant, what had grown between them these past 2 months had been real, regardless of the lie it began inside. She had promised to stay. She had, even in the promising, already begun planning how she would break it. "He's been in there 14 minutes, Cesare murmured, checking his watch, his hand never straying far from the weapon holstered beneath his jacket. "Volkov's men control the perimeter. If something goes wrong..." "How many men does Volkov have inside?" "3 that we've counted, possibly more we haven't." "And ours?" "2 with Signor Ferrara, myself and 1 other outside." Cesare's eyes cut to her, sharp with sudden understanding of exactly where her questions were heading. "Signora, whatever you're considering, I strongly advise against it. Signor Ferrara was explicit." "Signor Ferrara isn't here to argue with me," Delia said, already reaching for the door handle. "Cesare, I need you to trust me the way you trust him. I'm not walking into that restaurant to start a fight. I'm walking in because Volkov agreed to negotiate with a man he believes owes him blood. And I think there's something he doesn't know yet that might change the terms of that negotiation entirely." "What?" "That the debt he's chasing was never really Dante's to fully own alone," Delia said, the plan crystallizing even as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "Alessandro spent a decade paying it down before he died. That payment history exists somewhere, in records, in transfers, in whatever careful documentation a man as meticulous as Alessandro would have kept. If I can show Volkov that the debt is smaller than he believes, that a decade of good faith payment already reduced what's actually owed, it changes his calculus. Men like him respect precision, don't they? Precision might save Dante's life, where desperate pleading never could." Cesare studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his normally impassive expression. The same grudging respect she'd seen grow in Dante's father, in Bianca, in every person who had underestimated the quiet steel beneath her uncertain amnesiac beginning in this world. "The financial records are with the family's accountant," he said finally, reaching for his own phone. "Give me 5 minutes. If I can pull the relevant documentation, I'll come in with you. But Signora, if this goes wrong, if Volkov reads this as an insult rather than an offer, I need you to understand the danger isn't hypothetical." He has already tried to kill you once." "I understand," Delia said, and found, examining her own chest for fear and finding instead only a fierce, focused determination, that she meant it entirely. "I'm not afraid of him, Cesare. Not anymore. I've already lost a husband I never got the chance to properly grieve, and nearly lost the man who took his place in every way that matters. I am done losing people to a debt I had no part in creating. If precision and documentation can end this, I intend to walk in there and offer both." 5 minutes later, documentation in hand, Delia walked through the restaurant's unassuming front door, with Cesare a half-step behind her, and found the private back room where Dante sat across a table from a silver-haired man whose pale, patient eyes she recognized instantly from the chaos of that night in the mansion's east entrance. Dante's head snapped toward her, alarm and fury warring instantly across his face. "Delia!" "I told you to. I know what you told me," she said, crossing the room with a steadiness she hadn't fully expected of herself, setting the folder of documentation on the table between the two men with a decisive click. "I also know something you might not, Signor Volkov, that I think changes the terms of whatever conversation you've been having." Volkov's pale eyes moved over her with unhurried assessment, something almost like amusement flickering across his composed features. "The wife," he said, "or should I say, the widow who fell in love with her husband's brother without ever learning she'd been widowed at all. A remarkable story. I've heard several versions of it these past days." "Then you'll want to hear this version too," Delia said, opening the folder, spreading a decade of careful financial records across the table between them. Alessandro Ferrara spent 10 years quietly repaying the debt his brother incurred. Every transfer, every payment, documented meticulously. The man was many things, but careless with his accounting was never one of them. By my count, and I'd invite your own people to verify it independently, the original debt has already been reduced by nearly 70%. She held Volkov's gaze, steady despite the hammering of her own pulse. "You came here to collect what's owed. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to collect what's actually owed, precisely, rather than what's owed according to a story that hasn't been updated in a decade. I think a man of your reputation values precision over spectacle. I'm gambling that I'm right about that." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Delia could hear her own heartbeat, could see Dante's hand beneath the table curling into a fist against whatever violence he was holding carefully in check. Volkov studied the documents with the slow, thorough attention of a man who had built an empire on exactly this kind of patient scrutiny, and when he finally looked up, something in his cold eyes had shifted. Not warmth, precisely, but a recalibration. The look of a man revising a calculation he'd believed already settled. "You are correct," he said finally, "that I value precision." His eyes moved from the documents to Delia, then to Dante, weighing something Delia couldn't fully read. "You are also correct that this changes the terms of what I came here to collect." A long pause, deliberate, testing. "It does not, however, erase the insult of a man faking his own brother's death to escape what remains owed. Precision cuts both ways, Signora Ferrara. The debt is smaller, it is not gone, and the deception, that requires its own accounting, separate from any ledger." "Then name it," Dante said, his voice low and steady despite the visible tension coiled through his frame. "Whatever accounting you require for the deception, name it directly, and let's finish this today, one way or another. I am done living under the shadow of a debt that was never fully mine to carry alone, and I am absolutely finished letting it endanger the people I love while we circle each other with threats and warehouse ambushes." His hand found Delia's beneath the table, gripping tight.
"Name your price, Volkov. I'll pay it myself, honestly, under my own name, or we settle this the way your men tried to settle it in my house 3 weeks ago. Either way, this ends today."
Volkov's gaze moved between them for a long, calculating moment, and Delia held her breath, understanding that whatever he said next would determine not just the financial terms of a decade-old debt, but whether she and Dante would survive to build the life they'd only just begun to imagine together. 3 million, Volkov said finally, paid within 30 days, from your own accounts, under your own name, properly documented, properly witnessed, so that every family in this city understands the debt was settled by the man who actually owed it, not laundered through a dead brother's reputation.
His pale eyes narrowed slightly. "And a public acknowledgement, not a rumour management strategy, not a carefully worded statement crafted by lawyers. You, Dante Ferrara, standing in front of the families who matter in this city, admitting what you did, the theft that started this, and the deception that followed your brother's death. I want your name attached to your own history, in full. No more borrowed reputations shielding you from consequence." Dante's jaw tightened, and Delia felt the weight of what Volkov was asking settle over the table. Not just money, considerable as the sum was, but a public humiliation that would strip away every remaining shred of the careful mythology Alessandro's memory had provided him. "You're asking me to destroy what's left of my brother's legacy," Dante said quietly. "To let this city remember him not as the man who built an empire, but as the backdrop to my failures."
"I'm asking you to tell the truth," Volkov corrected, something almost gentle entering his otherwise implacable tone. "Which is a debt owed not to me, but to the brother whose name you wore for 2 months without his consent. He died protecting you, Signor Ferrara. I imagine he'd have wanted you to stop hiding behind that sacrifice eventually and start honouring it honestly instead." A pause, considering. "Or perhaps I flatter myself with sentiment I have no right to claim. Either way, those are my terms. 3 million, 30 days, and the truth spoken publicly, in your own voice. Refuse, and we return to the more traditional method of settling accounts, the one that nearly claimed both your lives 3 weeks ago."
"I would prefer the first option, if I'm honest. I find I have grown weary of unnecessary bloodshed in my advancing years, but I will not hesitate toward the second, if pushed."
Dante was quiet for a long moment, his hand still gripping Delia's beneath the table, and she felt, through the contact, the visible war happening inside him. Pride and grief and love and fear all tangled together into a decision that would define the rest of both their lives. "Agreed," he said finally. "All of it. The money, the public accounting, all of it." His voice, when it came, held none of the reluctance she might have expected, only a kind of exhausted, hard-won relief. "I've spent 2 months lying to protect a reputation that was never mine to protect in the first place. I'm tired of it, Volkov."
"Truthfully, more tired of it than I am afraid of whatever consequences honesty brings."
"My brother died telling the truth about who he was willing to sacrifice himself for. I think I owe him the same, finally, regardless of what it costs my pride." Something in Volkov's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, into what might have been respect.
"Then we have an agreement."
He rose, extending a hand across the table with the formal gravity of a man closing a chapter written in blood, and beginning, cautiously, a new one, written in something more civilized. 30 days, Signor Ferrara. I will be watching to ensure you honor it. But I find myself, against considerable expectation, willing to believe that you will. Dante shook his hand, and something in the room's tension broke, dissipating into the ordinary hum of a restaurant kitchen, audible faintly through the walls, the clink of glasses, the mundane sounds of a world that had, moments ago, felt entirely suspended. Outside, walking back toward the car with Cesare a discreet distance behind them, Dante finally turned to face her fully, disbelief and gratitude and something achingly tender all warring across his exhausted features. "You shouldn't have come in there," he said, but the reprimand had no force behind it at all, undercut entirely by the way his hands framed her face like something precious he couldn't quite believe was real. "You could have been killed, Delia. Walking in with those documents, gambling on Volkov's respect for precision, that could have gone catastrophically wrong." "But it didn't," she said, covering his hands with her own. "And Dante, I wasn't going to sit in a car outside while you negotiated for your life alone. Not after everything. Not after I already chose, once, to run toward the danger instead of away from it. That choice doesn't have an expiration date just because the crisis technically ended." "I love you," he said, the words breaking out of him with a rawness that had nothing to do with performance, nothing to do with the careful, curated devotion of the man she'd first woken beside 2 months ago. "I love you so completely it terrifies me, and I have loved you through a lie I should never have told, and I am going to spend every single day for the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the fact that you walked into that restaurant today instead of waiting safely outside." "Then start today," she said, smiling despite the exhaustion, despite everything they'd survived to reach this fragile, hopeful moment. "Take me home, Dante Ferrara, and let's figure out together what the rest of this life is actually supposed to look like." They drove back through the golden Roman evening in silence, hands intertwined on the seat between them, and Delia allowed herself, for the first time since waking in that unfamiliar bed 2 months earlier, to believe that the worst of the danger might finally, truly, be behind them. She was wrong. But the peace, however temporary, was real while it lasted, and she would learn in the weeks that followed that surviving Volkov's terms was only the first of several reckonings still waiting to arrive. The gathering Volkov's terms required took place 3 weeks later, in a ballroom not unlike the one where Delia had first sensed the wrongness humming beneath her marriage. The same crystal chandeliers, the same assembled weight of the city's most powerful families, except this time Dante stood at the centre of the room, not to perform an inherited identity, but to strip it away entirely, in front of everyone who mattered. Delia stood beside him, her hand in his, watching the colour drain from the faces of men who had spent 2 months believing they were addressing Alessandro Ferrara, watching whispers ripple outward through the crowd as Dante spoke, haltingly at first, then with a steadiness that grew as he continued, as though the act of speaking the truth aloud were burning away some old, corrosive weight he'd carried far longer than the 2 months of active deception. "My name is Dante Ferrara," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. "Not Alessandro. My brother died 6 weeks before most of you believed I did, shot, protecting me from a debt that was mine to carry, not his. I made the decision, in the chaos and grief of that night, to let the world believe I was him. I told myself it was to protect this family's name, to protect the woman I—" His eyes found Delia's, steady and unashamed. "To protect my brother's wife. From grief I couldn't bear to watch her carry alongside everything else. Those were real reasons. They were also, I understand now, insufficient justification for the lie itself. I owed all of you, and I owed her most of all, the truth from the beginning. I am telling it now, belatedly, because it is never too late to stop hiding from what you actually are." The silence that followed was total. Charged, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with gunfire and everything to do with the particular violence of social ruin these families were capable of inflicting through nothing more than withdrawn alliances and whispered condemnation. Salvatore Ferrara, standing near the front of the assembled crowd, was the first to move. He crossed to his son with the deliberate, unhurried gravity of a man aware that every eye in the room was tracking his response. And for one terrible, suspended moment, Delia thought he might publicly disown him, exactly as he'd threatened weeks earlier. Instead, he placed a hand on Dante's shoulder, brief, stiff, entirely uncharacteristic of the cold formality that had defined every interaction Delia had witnessed between them, and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "My son has made a grave error and has had the courage to correct it publicly, at considerable cost to his own standing. I would remind everyone in this room that courage, however delayed, is rarer in this business than perfect judgment. I stand behind him." It wasn't warmth, not entirely, but it was enough to shift the room's uncertain calculus, enough for the whispers to shift from condemnation towards something more complicated, more grudgingly respectful. One by one, the families who mattered most began to approach, not with warmth, but with the careful transactional acknowledgement that suggested Dante's alliance was still worth cultivating despite the scandal now attached to his name. Bianca found them near the edge of the room, an hour into the slow, exhausting work of rehabilitating a reputation in real time. "Well," she said, surveying the room with her usual sharp assessment, "that could have gone considerably worse. I half expected the Moretti to walk out entirely." "They almost did," Dante said grimly. Salvatore's endorsement changed the calculation. "I owe him more than I know how to repay." "You owe yourself something too," Bianca said, unexpectedly gentle. "You stood up there and told an entire room of dangerous, judgmental people the truth about your own worst decision, knowing it might cost you everything you'd built. That takes a particular kind of courage most of the men in this room have never once demonstrated." Her eyes moved to Delia, warm despite the underlying complexity that would probably always exist between them. "And you? Walking into that restaurant with documentation instead of a gun, talking Volkov down from blood to precision. I underestimated you badly, Delia, when we first met. I won't make that mistake again." Later that night, back in the penthouse that no longer felt like a fortress built on lies, Dante drew Delia against him on the balcony, overlooking the sleeping city. Exhaustion and relief mingling in the loosening of his shoulders, the softness returning to eyes that had spent the entire evening braced for catastrophe. "It's not over," he said quietly. "The money's still owed. The reputation will take years to fully rebuild, if it rebuilds at all. There will be families who never fully trust me again, and I understand that, and I've made my peace with the cost." "But we're still here," Delia said, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her ear. "Together. Honestly, for the first time since I woke up in that bed, not knowing your name." "Together," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "For as long as you'll have me." Which, I'm hoping, against every reasonable expectation, given how badly I've handled all of this, might turn out to be a very long time indeed. She laughed, soft and real, and felt something settle inside her chest that had been unsteady since the moment she'd first opened her eyes to a stranger's face and a stranger's name. Not certainty, exactly, because certainty felt like too fragile a thing to claim after everything they'd survived, but something sturdier than that. Hope built not on a lie this time, but on the hard-won, unglamorous foundation of truth finally spoken, consequences finally faced, and love that had somehow, improbably, survived the telling. The weeks that followed settled into something Delia hadn't expected to feel again so soon after the chaos of the ballroom, the restaurant, the gunfire in the garden. Peace. Fragile, hard-won, and entirely unlike the manufactured calm of those first weeks after her accident, when every gentle gesture from the man beside her had been, however lovingly intended, built on a foundation she hadn't consented to stand on. This peace felt different. Earned. Dante threw himself into settling the Volkov debt with a discipline that bordered on penance, liquidating assets, restructuring the family's holdings, working through nights with an intensity Delia recognized eventually, not as obsession, but as a man determined to close this particular chapter cleanly, so that whatever came next could begin on entirely honest ground. "You don't have to punish yourself indefinitely," she told him one night, finding him still at his desk past midnight, papers spread in front of him, with the same meticulous care she now recognized as a Ferrara family trait, inherited or absorbed from a brother he'd spent his whole life standing in the shadow of. "The debt will be paid. The truth is told. At some point, Dante, you're allowed to simply live in the life you've built, instead of endlessly atoning for how you built it." "I know," he said, setting down his pen, rubbing at eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I think some part of me is afraid that if I stop working this hard to make it right, I'll lose the right to keep you, as though the atonement is the price of admission, and if I ever stop paying it, you'll remember I don't actually deserve what I have." "That's not how love works," Delia said, crossing to him, settling into his lap with the easy, unself-conscious intimacy that had grown between them over months of hard-won honesty. "I'm not staying because you're punishing yourself adequately enough to earn it. I'm staying because I choose you, every single day, the same way you choose me. That's not a debt either of us is paying down. It's just this. Us. Chosen. Freely. With the truth fully known." He kissed her then, slow and grateful, and something in his shoulders finally, visibly loosened. They visited Alessandro's grave together that same week, a quiet cemetery outside Rome, his headstone simple compared to the ostentatious wealth that had defined his life. And Dante knelt beside it for a long time in silence, while Delia stood a respectful distance away, giving him the space to grieve a brother whose death he had never fully allowed himself to properly mourn, buried as it was beneath 2 months of frantic deception. "I'm sorry," she heard him say, quiet enough that she almost missed it, "for everything I took from you, without asking. Your name, your wife's grief, the chance for her to properly mourn you instead of falling in love with your shadow." A long pause. "I hope, wherever you are, that you understand why I did it. And I hope, even more than that you'd forgive the fact that somewhere in the middle of stealing your life, I fell in love with the woman you left behind. Not as a betrayal of what she meant to you, but because loving her taught me, finally, what kind of man you always were. The kind who protects the people he loves without counting the cost. I'm trying to be that man now, brother, for her, in your memory, if nothing else." When he rose and returned to her side, his eyes wet, but his shoulders finally, visibly lighter, Delia took his hand and said nothing at all, understanding that some grief required witness rather than words, and that she had, finally, given him the space to grieve honestly, instead of performing a version of moving on that had never been real. It was Delia that evening who finally allowed herself the fragment of memory she'd been avoiding since the ballroom, not forced this time, but arriving gently, almost like a gift, as she sat with Dante on the terrace, watching the sun set over a city that had nearly cost them everything, and given them, somehow, an unlikely future instead. She remembered Alessandro properly for the first time. Not the wedding, not the fragmented flashes of scars and smiles that had first alerted her to the deception, but a quieter memory, a conversation weeks before the accident in a kitchen with yellow walls that must have belonged to some house they'd shared before the penthouse. Alessandro, laughing at something she'd said, his hand warm on the small of her back, telling her that whatever happened to him, whatever danger his world eventually brought to their door, he wanted her to promise she'd let herself be happy afterward. Not guilty happiness, not haunted happiness, real happiness, unashamed, however it found her. She hadn't understood, in the memory, why he'd made her promise something so strange, so specific. She understood now. "I remembered him," she told Dante quietly, watching the last light fade over the rooftops. Properly, this time. Not the confusion, not the wrongness I felt every time I looked at your jaw and searched for a scar. Just him, alive, happy, telling me to let myself be happy, whatever happened to him. Dante went very still beside her. "What did you feel, remembering that?" "Grief," she admitted. "Real grief, finally, for the man I actually married, instead of the strange, unmoored confusion I'd been carrying instead." She turned to face him, found his eyes wet again, watching her with a vulnerability that had nothing to do with fear of losing her and everything to do with hope, fragile and unguarded. And underneath the grief, permission. I think he would have wanted this, Dante. Not because he'd have wanted to lose me to you specifically, but because he loved you enough to die protecting you. And I don't think a man who loved you that fiercely would want either of us to spend the rest of our lives punishing ourselves for finding happiness in the wreckage he left behind. "I don't deserve that grace," Dante said, his voice rough. Maybe not, Delia agreed gently, but I'm giving it to you anyway. That's what grace is, I think. Not something earned, something offered freely. Because the alternative, carrying this weight forever, refusing every kindness because you don't feel worthy of it, that's not honouring his memory, Dante. That's just another kind of hiding. He pulled her close, and they sat together as the last light faded entirely from the sky. Two people who had built something real out of the wreckage of a lie, carrying forward not just the memory of a man who had died protecting them both, but the fragile, hard-won permission to let that memory become a foundation instead of a haunting. A year later, Delia stood on the same terrace where she'd finally let herself grieve properly, watching the sun set gold over a city that had once terrified her and now, improbably, felt like home. Not the fortress she'd woken inside, not knowing whose name she wore, but a life she'd chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, with every truth finally spoken between them. The Volkov debt had been settled in full 8 months earlier, in a formal ceremony that Volkov himself had attended with an unexpected gravity that bordered, Bianca insisted afterward, on genuine respect. Salvatore Ferrara, in the months since, had softened by degrees so small they were only visible in retrospect. An unexpected visit here, a grudging compliment there, the slow thaw of a man who had spent decades mistaking coldness for strength, finally beginning to understand that his surviving son's willingness to face consequences honestly might be its own different kind of strength entirely. Bianca had become, against every expectation Delia might once have held, something like a friend, sharp-tongued and complicated, carrying her own grief for the Ferrara brother she'd loved and lost to circumstance rather than death, but present, steady, unexpectedly loyal in the particular way of people who have survived danger together and emerged changed by the shared history of it. And Dante. Dante had rebuilt not just his reputation, but himself, piece by careful piece, in the year since he'd stood in front of a ballroom full of dangerous, judgmental strangers and told them the truth about the worst decision of his life. He still bore the shadow of his brother in every mirror, still carried the particular grief of a man who would spend the rest of his life measuring himself against a ghost. But he no longer hid from that shadow, no longer wore it like a stolen coat. He simply lived alongside it, honestly, the way Delia had taught him honesty could be survived. "You're thinking too hard again," Dante said, joining her on the terrace, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting against her hair with the easy, unguarded intimacy that had become, over the past year, simply the texture of their ordinary days. "I can feel it from here." "I'm thinking about how strange it is," she admitted, leaning back into him, "that the worst thing that ever happened to me, waking up with no memory, married to a stranger wearing a dead man's name, turned into this. Into the truest, most solid thing I've ever built." "Do you regret any of it?" he asked, quiet, the old vulnerability still surfacing sometimes, even after everything. "If you could go back, choose differently." She turned in his arms to face him, studying the face she'd learned to love not despite its lies, but through the slow, painful process of stripping them away entirely. The small scar she'd added to his jaw herself, unknowingly, the night he'd caught the edge of a table, protecting her from a fall during a storm, so that now, finally, the scar in her fragmented memory of a wedding day matched the man standing in front of her. Not because he'd worn his brother's face, but because their own history had written itself into his skin instead. "No," she said simply. "I don't regret it. I regret that it cost what it cost. Alessandro's life, the lies, the danger, everyone who bled for us to reach this moment. I will always carry that grief alongside this happiness, and I think that's right. That's honest. That's what it actually means to build a life on truth instead of comfortable fiction." She reached up, traced the scar on his jaw with her thumb, the same gesture she'd glimpsed in a fragmented memory that had once terrified her with its wrongness, and now, finally, felt entirely, wonderfully right. "But I don't regret you, Dante. I don't regret choosing you. Every single day since I learned your real name, over and over, with the truth fully known. That choice has never once felt like settling for less than what I lost. It's felt like finding something I didn't know I was looking for, in the wreckage of a life I never got the chance to properly begin." He kissed her then, slow and certain, no lies left standing between them, no locked studies or broken locks or fragmented memories waiting to unravel some carefully constructed fiction. Just the truth, finally, fully spoken. A man who had once stolen a name to escape a debt, choosing instead, day after day, to earn the right to keep the family he'd built inside that theft, honestly, from the ground up. Behind them, through the terrace doors, Marta's voice called that dinner was ready, and somewhere below, Delia could hear Cesare's low laugh at something Bianca had said, dropping by, as she often did now, for the kind of easy, unglamorous evening that had become, against every dark and dangerous beginning, simply their life. Delia took Dante's hand, and together they turned back toward the house, toward dinner, toward the ordinary warmth of people who had survived extraordinary danger to reach this particular evening, toward a future neither of them had expected to find inside a lie, and had built instead, brick by honest brick, into something entirely, permanently their own. The city glittered below them, indifferent as ever to the lives unfolding inside its ancient walls. But for the first time since she'd woken in an unfamiliar bed asking a stranger's name, Delia understood, with a certainty that needed no fragmented memory to support it, exactly who her husband was. Not a stolen name, not a dead man's shadow, just Dante. Flawed, honest, fiercely loving, hers. And the truth, finally, entirely enough.